It's a great evening being able to share ideas with the museum community in Vancouver. I'm hoping that the way that I present, the things that I talk about, will meld pretty well with what we've talked about so far. Of course, I'm coming from a different context. The concerns and values we have depend upon the context from which we come. And one of the issues for us is that we're new. We're at a different stage of life than the other museums. But the other is that our intellectual context is one of biology. And so my neighbors are molecular biologists and ecologists, and it's to a certain extent to them to whom I respond or my concerns are expressed. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about who we are, history, and one of the reasons that I might go into some details that the other speakers haven't gone into is simply because none of you have seen us. And it's probably worthwhile just sort of introducing more or less who we are in a fairly basic way. The museum is new in one sense, but old in another sense. Just as with the Museum of Anthropology, there are roots that go much deeper. So in fact, what we are as a collection is the coalescence of a series of collections that have existed at UBC over the decades back to the early 20th century, with some specimens going into the 19th century. So in the past, the Fish Museum, the Herbarium, the Entomological Museum, the Vertebrate Museum, the fossil collection, and a few other smaller ones have been scattered, hidden away in different rooms at UBC in various places. And so what we represent now is the coalescence to a single facility shown at the top. We are primarily a research collection with ongoing acquisitions. So the spider in the little floating in the alcohol in the vial in the jar at the lower right was once alive in the forest in Papua New Guinea. I went there in 2008, collected the spider, brought it back, studied it, and pickled it. And this is the way most of our specimens are acquired. And in fact, the scope of the collection depends very much on the research activities of those researchers at UBC that have dealt with biodiversity in one way or another. So our fish collection is very large because of the activity of a past ichthyologist, likewise with various components of our herbarium. And other aspects of the collection, such as entomology. And so we are the accidental accumulation, in some sense, of the remnants of the research of biodiversity researchers at UBC. We have about 2 million specimens in total. To talk about some of our perhaps most interesting specimens or ones with special stories, any biological species that's discovered and named has a single specimen to which that name is attached. It's the name bearer of the species. And we have, so for instance, that spider that I showed you before was the first representative of a species new to science. I described the species and I attached the name of that species that I gave to that specimen. And there's only a single specimen in the world that we can claim has that status for any given species. UBC's collections have a couple hundred specimens of that sort. They're called type specimens. We have some extinct species. Any guesses as to what the big bird is? Passenger pigeon, yeah. Probably our most famous specimen will be the blue whale, the big skeleton that's being prepared and then will be articulated on Vancouver Island. It will be hanging in our atrium in a slightly different pose than shown here, visible from Main Mall, but also at lower right as it would appear once you're in the atrium. The specimens that we have played two major roles. They're vouchers for past research, basically to confirm identification. An ecologist does a study, says, I found this thing here doing that. Someone can later come along to confirm that, in fact, he or she got the identification right. As well, they serve as resources for future research. And of course, this is common to all of the material that all of the museums here have been talking about. As new methods are developed, we can apply them to these specimens, for instance, to gather DNA from our specimens. Or it could just be that you want more data of different sorts that you hadn't gathered before. In the case of natural history collections, it's also important, just as with cultural collections, to be able to gather snapshots through time. So as collections were accumulated in different decades, we can go back and look at where the specimens of a particular species lived in the 1930s or the 1940s, which could, of course, be important for understanding the effects of global climate change, as well as other issues. Until recently, all specimen acquisition in our collections has been research related, and that's it. We are now starting to think about acquisition for display purposes, but that's new for us. So one of the questions that I think it might have been Amanda or somebody in the earlier discussions putting this together is to ask the question, are we just a warehouse? Are these museums just archives, just holding specimens? And in thinking about this, I like to think about Calvin's time machine. You may know Calvin and Hobbes. Calvin has a big cardboard box that he writes things on and turns into transmogrifiers and time machines and so forth. And one of the things he did is he turned it into a time machine, went back to see dinosaurs. Now, he claims here that he's going back to see the dinosaurs in order to take photographs to sell them. But we know he went back because it would just be so cool to see dinosaurs. Yeah. And probably all of us dream, and especially if we're in the museum field, dream of going back and seeing those artifacts in their own context originally, whether it's a dinosaur bone, whether it's some special thing from the 17th century, whatever. As a biologist, I know that in 500 years, we will wish we had time machines to come back to now. In 500 years, we may very well be in a post-biodiversity world. We will wish then that we could come back to now and see biodiversity more or less intact, which is where we are now. It's more or less intact. Chances are it won't be there in 500 years. In 500 years, there's a really good chance that there will not be any of those spiders of that species alive in Papua New Guinea. And the only ones that will remain are the ones that are in our museum.